so the idea, most people will hear that and be like, well, business growth, so profit, growing the company, all these kind of things. But actually, it's the growth of the individuals and the teams within the company. And so one of the most kind of core motivations for all of us is the motivation to grow. And so the companies and the leaders that are tapping into that natural motivation, they're finding that their employees are not only more fulfilled and more productive and the performance is higher, but then because of that, the organization's growth then improves, and oftentimes improves pretty substantially.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to episode 9 of the Status Joe podcast. Appreciate everybody tuning in. My guest today is Dr. Heather Wickman. Got her book right here with me with tabs and highlights and all. Her book is called The Evolved Executive: The Future of Work is Love in Action. I highly recommend this to anybody who's in a corporate role, especially if you're in or have found yourself in the past in a what I'll call toxic environment. Maybe you don't love your boss. Maybe you don't love what you're doing. You're looking to affect some sort of change within your organization. I've certainly experienced this in my career. I will definitely take some of the learnings from this book into my day job, have an awesome conversation, and really get into some of the details around how we can bring care and love into the organizations and not maybe be focused on just productivity all the time, and how that can actually improve profit, drive growth. So with that being said, I'll quit talking and let you guys listen to the interview. So thanks for tuning in. Well, look, Dr. Wickman, I really appreciate you coming on. Read your book. Fantastic. Marked it up with all my little red sticky notes here. Before we kind of dive into like some of the details in here, though, I thought what would be really cool is you talk about it a little bit in the book, but maybe if you could just give us a little bit of like your journey and how you kind of got to this point of, because a lot of the things you write about in the book are, realizations you've had from being in the workplace. And so I think it'd be interesting for the audience to maybe hear about your journey and how we got here. And then we can kind of, see where the conversation goes from there.
Yeah. It's an interesting one. And I borrow the phrase that I'm an accidental entrepreneur because I never thought I'd be at this place. I love the name of your podcast, kind of that status quo.
Right.
Was the way that I built my life for the majority of my career and my adult life. Like I, grew up in a really small town, had that kind of Midwest roots of, be humble, kind of stay small, all of those kind of programmings. Went to college, started climbing the career ladder, continued with my education. So got my undergrad, my master's, and my PhD by the time I was 31 and was like serious about my climb. And, I had that vision of the white picket fence and, a nice house in the suburbs. And
yeah, not all it's cut out to be, right?
That.
Yeah.
So I had kind of a corporate crack, is what I call it. So was in corporate America for about 12 years and in healthcare primarily.
Yep.
And for the majority of that career, was really learning a lot and diving into new skills, learning how to lead and then build teams and then helping new teams and teams of teams and organizations. And was all well and good until it wasn't, and got to a place in my career where I was working with the top executives and there was just so much toxicity happening, and I don't really blame it on, the organization or those leaders. It's just they were doing what they knew how to do, and our organizational systems and the way in which we prepare leaders is ill-prepared to kind of face the challenges we have today. And so reached this point where I just ended up resigning completely.
Now, was this like you said did it come kind of quickly, or was it like a build over like a year or two and then you just kind of snapped? Or I don't want to say snapped, maybe that's a little bit too hyperbolic.
That's the perfect word. I think it was building, but my awareness of it wasn't all that stellar. And so, I was getting more and more anxious, more and more, I would say, depressed,
Right.
Unfulfilled in the work that I was doing.
Yeah.
To the point where I was just like, the soul is getting sucked out of me. Like, I can't do this anymore. And basically made that decision then within a week. So, like, cracked and was like, I'm out. Peace out. And we sold everything.
No plan, nothing?
Nothing.
That's awesome.
You probably read a little bit of that.
Yeah, I did.
We had no plan. We sold our house. Both of our dogs passed away the year before, so we don't have kids. And so it's like we are completely untethered. And
right.
Traveled to Thailand for 3 months, and that kicked our butts pretty good, and from there kind of built Untethered, what we do today.
That's awesome. Okay, so I want to read a little excerpt that I think summarizes the book, and I'll probably say this in the intro, but the name of the book is The Evolved Executive. The Future of Work is Love in Action. And love is like, I feel like if I could summarize this book up in one word, probably have to say that's like, I think that's like the number one word that could describe it. But I found this excerpt and I was hoping you could elaborate on it a little bit and maybe tie it into the book. But it's about, you talk about proving yourself and valuing yourself, right? Which you could also say is maybe loving yourself. And you said that at work we seem to be programmed to prove ourselves, to show other people we're smart, competent, good, and hide our perceived weaknesses and inadequacies. I've dedicated myself to the practice of catching myself in the throes of proving myself and interrupting the pattern by taking one deep, purposeful breath. In that pause, I have the choice to take the next step from a place of deep care and respect for myself, not to prove myself to another. There is a potent reclaiming process when we become aware of this proving cycle and stop it in its tracks. I think that's like a beautifully written passage, but could you maybe elaborate on that a little bit? Talk about maybe how that how that plays into some of the toxicity you were dealing with, and maybe give some examples, and then kind of relate it to the broader book and this whole idea you have around transforming the workplace. I know I
think this is
a loaded question, a big question, so we can break it down.
Yeah, I think this is a big issue within our lives and within the workplace as well. I kind of think of it as like we're paying everyone to do a second job that no one pays any attention to, and that is hiding who we actually are. It's kind of the masks that we wear so that others perceive us in the way that we want them to perceive us. Mm-hmm. So whether it's really competent, achieved, whatever it is, and there is this really important process of awareness that happens when you understand that you have a mask on and that you are trying to show up in a certain way that may not be actually who you are. And so my example is I'm that stereotypical overachieving, always saying yes, trying to do more so that I look good, so that I am valuable. And that covers a mask of insecurity of like, well, if you actually know who I am, then maybe you're not going to accept me. Maybe I'm not going to be a part of the cool, the fun stuff that's happening. And it also relates just to this connection of self-love in terms of worth. In the book, I speak to self-worth being this unconditional loyalty to yourself. And it's been a wild practice for me to catch myself when I'm in that mode of trying to manipulate myself so that I'm perceived a certain way versus just authentically showing up who I am in that very moment.
And I think it gets worse too as and this is probably you noticed, as you get higher up, right, there's this expectation that you are supposed to know everything. And you tend to have a lot of type A people, I think, whose they derive their value, and I'm speaking for myself a little bit here too, right? You derive your value from the work that you do, right? And so I think when people feel like they don't know something or threatened, and their sense of value, right, comes from the work they do, that's when you probably get a lot of that toxicity, right? Because a lot of it's driven out of insecurities, I think.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's really strange because what creates trust and cohesion in a team the most is when a leader can be vulnerable and be like, I don't really know the answer to that question, but I'm sure together we can find out.
Yeah.
And it's so counterintuitive to what we're taught and what we think we should be doing as leaders.
Yeah. It's interesting too, you talk about the mask. A girl I used to date, and one day we were talking and she was like, you talk different now. And I was like, what do you mean? She's like, I feel like you talk like you're on a conference call now, but it's like bleeding over into your real life. And I was like, I think you're right. And it's so funny because we have all these terms, right, that we use. I don't know, I think of them. We say them all the time in work, but like the long pole in the tent, boil the ocean, right? And it's like, it's like the reason you're taught not to use cliches, right, is because like you're not using your own voice. But in business, everybody, like 20% of the words, 30% of the words that people say, right, are all these cliches that we've all been taught.
Yeah, it's really, that has been stark as I've moved out of the day-to-day corporate America world in terms of, like you said, finding your own voice and not relying on kind of the language and the verbiage that you hear all around you and that you see modeled all around you. So you begin to think like, okay, I should say those things if that's, the position that I want or the group that I want to be in. And so it is really fascinating to step away from that and be like, okay, that's not my voice at all. And
right.
So I really appreciate your friend's comment of like, hey, you better check yourself here. Something's going on that's probably not real.
Yeah. And do you think that some of this has been driven by the rapid, you talk about this in the book a little bit, by just the rate at which things are changing constantly? Like you referenced that, Fortune 50 companies or Fortune 500 companies, I think they used to have a life cycle, or they used to be in the Fortune 500 for, was it 67 years? And now it's down to like 10 maybe. So we've shaved off 50 years of that. Do you think a lot of this is being driven by the pressure of continuing to grow the company, drive revenue, drive profits, that's creating some of these toxic environments?
I do. So you're referencing the Fortune 500 disease, and I found that just so fascinating, just that the longevity of these organizations are basically crashing and burning. And what we're finding is it's, purpose-driven, heart-driven, care-driven companies are the ones that are lasting. And so I think you're right. It'd be my hypothesis as well, and the research that I found is that organizations that are strictly focused on a profit growth, a shareholder growth, with no regard really to the health of the entire organization or all of the stakeholders, the employees, the communities, the environment, those are the ones that are really suffering. And we see that their longevity is kind of shortening because it just doesn't sustain itself.
Can you give some examples of what's, I'll call them successful companies are doing, or the companies that are lasting are doing, in terms of, I don't want to say not focusing on profit, because they're all focusing on profit or else they wouldn't be around, but how they're maybe bifurcating their goals into profit and purpose, and then using that to drive towards organizational success?
Yeah, the one that jumps out the most and I've seen the most powerful is focusing on growth. And there's two sides to this equation, right? So the idea, most people will hear that and be like, well, business growth, so profit, growing the company, all these kind of things. But actually it's the growth of the individuals and the teams within the company. And so one of the most kind of core motivations for all of us is the motivation to grow. And so the companies and the leaders that are tapping into that natural motivation, they're finding that their employees are not only more fulfilled and more productive and the performance is higher, but then because of that, the organization's growth then improves, and oftentimes improves pretty substantially. So the biggest takeaway that I would say is the ones that can focus on growth, and more often than not, that growth ties into that company's purpose in one way, shape, or form. And so there's a lot of things I talk a little bit about in the book, this idea of a deliberately developmental organization. So this idea of weaving personal and team growth basically into everything that you're doing. It's not like this training event you do one quarter and you come back and all of a sudden all your problems are fixed.
Team building activities where you like pass a ball around in a circle and with only using one hand or something.
Yeah, but finding ways to do like these growth sprints so that it's part of everything that you're doing and it's part of the work that you're doing, so it's not like this extracurricular thing that you're doing on the side.
Yeah,
that seems to be not only the best for individuals because they want to be a part of that, but also for the organizations in terms of its growth and profitability.
Yeah, I feel like as bad of a rap as millennials get, which is certainly the category I fall into, I feel like we kind of spearheaded some of this where, and we're looked at as crazy when we would say we want purpose in our job, right? And I think if you look at baby boomers or Gen X, that just wasn't as prevalent. And so some of this too might be the fact that we all grew up, most the millennial generation definitely more comfortably than our parents. And we don't necessarily want to just make more money and rise up the corporate ladder, right? But we want to feel like what we're doing every day not only has impact, right, but fulfills us in some way that makes it worth like getting up and sitting at a computer for 9 to 10 hours, right?
Absolutely. Like this is the shocking fact that most people, millennials as well as kind of into my space, Gen X, is we would take a pay cut to have work that's meaningful and fulfilling. And that is shocking to other generations who work for a paycheck, you clock in, clock out, and then you retire. Like we are asking for so much of a different experience, kind of that psychic income. It's not only the money in my pocket, it's like how do I feel both emotionally, mentally, and spiritually as it relates to my work.
Yeah, when I started, I'm an accountant, CPA by background, and started out my career in New York doing mergers and acquisitions. So you can imagine how that is from a work-life balance,
Yeah.
literally 90, 100-hour weeks,
Right.
Routinely. But they dangle the golden handcuffs in front of you, right? They pay you a ton of money coming out of high school. And I just remember when I was in college thinking like all I want to do is just make as much money as I can. And then 6 months into being in New York, I was like, maybe there is something to doing things outside of work. And it took me 2 or 3 years to finally switch from that like banking, M&A, consulting, financial consulting lifestyle into a more like balanced corporate role, and took a pay cut for it, and still look back as that being one of the best decisions I've ever made, just for my mental health. I mean, I couldn't have lasted doing that for much longer than I did.
It's tragic, man. So many of my clients are in that situation where it's the golden handcuffs. They are at such an executive level where the pay and the perks are so great, but like there's no soul in it for them. And so they're always contemplating this transition of like, how do I give up this for something that has meaning in my life? And so kudos to you for making that decision early.
Yeah, I was about to say, I think the thing that I got lucky a little bit, and maybe I was smart, but it does, the older you get, and you have a family and a house and kids, dogs, it you've built up this lifestyle that you have to maintain, and it's funded by this job that you may not necessarily like.
Maybe handcuffs.
Yeah. So what are your suggestions for people who maybe 2 things? How can they affect change within their organization, right, to kind of promote some of the things you talk about? And when is it time to say, maybe I should look for something else?
Yeah. That's like the $1 million question. Yeah, so how can you affect change is a tricky one. And so as I work with clients, the biggest change that we can make is within oneself. And so depending on the change that individual wants to affect, we can oftentimes do a lot of things to make it better, whether it's, I need to have a higher performing team, or I need to be able to move through conflict more effectively, or deal with ambiguity, or whatever it might be. And so there's a lot of experiences that we can create that allow an executive, an entrepreneur, to be able to navigate change better, not only within themselves, but lead their teams through change. The trickier part becomes your second question of like, when do I know when to like cut bait? And that is a really interesting and actually rewarding space for me to be in as an executive coach, in terms of really helping that individual understand kind of the values conflicts that may or may not be present that are non-negotiables. And so oftentimes those can help guide an individual to make that decision of like, is the conflict just too high to stay here? So the money might be good, but the cost of my happiness, my time is just too high. I need to find something else. So it oftentimes takes a pretty decent deep dive into what's most important, what's non-negotiable, and what is tolerable, to be able to kind of make that decision of like, well, is now the time to cut bait? Because at the end of the day, you have to discover you're always going to find yourself on the other side. So if you're just running from a situation that you've created, we've got to fix that, or otherwise it's just going to keep following you.
Yeah.
And at times there are situations within an organization where, the structure or your leadership team above you is just at a place where it's just
untenable. Yeah.
Forward. Yeah.
What do you think I'd be curious to get your thoughts on the impacts of COVID and working from home has kind of had on all of this, because I'm permanently work from home now. Although the company I work for is trying to put an office in Nashville where I work. And they were shocked when they took a survey that everybody said they wanted to at least do like a hybrid model where you could come into the office for like maybe 3-4 days, pick your choice. But what are your thoughts on the what's the word, maybe the disconnectedness that we have now that everything is virtual and apart, right? You're having meetings all day with people you're not in the same room with. Sometimes the camera's not on, you can't read their body language.
Yeah.
It's harder to say things maybe when somebody's standing right in front of you than over the phone.
Yeah. It's a whole ball of wax, right? So there's a lot of trust implications that happen when we go virtually, especially when there's no opportunity to connect face to face and kind of have those water cooler happy hour conversations. And so we're having to kind of recreate or create different opportunities for those connections. And so I work with a client that does, like a happy hour every month.
Right.
So they're not working together in person, but they're at least finding some social avenue to stay connected as humans. But I probably have a little different perspective on this, in that I don't think we were connecting in meaningful ways even before COVID.
Right.
So oftentimes the way we connect is through kind of gossip and some toxic kind of things that lead to mistrust and frustration and all sorts of issues in organizations. So the way in which I'm guiding clients is we have to find new and better ways to connect with one another regardless of COVID. So if it's going to be virtually, or if it's going to be hybrid, or all back in the office, I still think we have to find healthier ways to connect and actually learn about who we're working with. Who are you as a human?
Yeah.
And how can I support that? And how can I support your growth?
Beyond like a happy hour, do you have any other thoughts on or examples of things that you can do to kind of improve that connectedness?
Yeah, so there's a bunch of little practices, and one is a super simple one, and you'll find that in the book as well, called the checkin. So I know this sounds really simple, but at the beginning of every meeting, before you dive into the content of the tasks and the to-dos and the things you need to get done, you simply take a minute and go around the room or the virtual room and be like, okay, what's going on? Is there anything you need to get off of your chest to be fully present in this moment?
Right.
And as, again, simple as that sounds.
Now there's got to be some org change there, right, to make people feel comfortable to where they can actually say what's bothering them, right?
Well, yeah. I mean, if you're having a hard time with that question, then we've got a bigger problem.
Right.
So that's a simple one. I've also seen teams have kind of a team question. And so whether it be like, what's your kid's favorite X, Y, or Z, or something just to get to know a little bit more personal elements. And then we do like growth sprints where you put teams together to do like deep dive growth things as it relates to things they need to get better at work. That's a really powerful and fast way to increase cohesion and connectedness on the team.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think we're seeing this too. It's not just in the workplace, right? I think social media and the way we communicate is driving a lot of this.
Well, here's a question. Do you feel connected to the people that you work with?
It's interesting, yes, but then when we get together, especially, I feel way more connected and there's way more cohesion. So it makes me think, what scares me is that my definition of that has been skewed over the last 2 years now, right? And I've become normalized to sitting in my office and just talking to people or emailing them all day. But once the company I work for is based out of Miami, so I'll go down once a month, and I feel way more I have a way better sense of what's going on in the org. I'm more connected to people. You're face to face, and typically all the people who are remote kind of come in on a monthly cadence. So it's everybody flows into the office at once, and it's buzzing with good energy, and we'll go out and get drinks and dinner together, and that. I remember when COVID first hit. I guess it was, about 2 years ago, March of 2020. And then I was with a different organization at the time, but the first time we felt comfortable was my small team. It was 4 or 5 of us on a business development team. We went out and just got dinner and a couple drinks together. And it was I felt so much better after doing that than and some of that might've been COVID driven, but it just kind of it helped just reorient you to, okay, this is more normal than maybe the remote stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I have no doubt that the greatest form of connection comes when you can actually connect in person, face to face, all those kind of things. Whether or not it's feasible, then we have to design some different things. But I love what your company is doing in terms of bringing people back so that they can have that monthly reconnection and almost that kind of fill up your jar of your colleagues' energy and kind of the good vibes to kind of carry you through for the rest of the month. Yeah,
it's definitely helpful. So maybe we pivot here a little bit. We were talking earlier. You said you were listening to my last episode about the ayahuasca trip, and you had a little a chapter in here about plant-based medicines and how that can kind of improve your mental health and well-being. I was hoping you could kind of dive into that a little bit. It's obviously a subject that interests me because I've had a podcast about it. Now I'm asking you.
Yeah. So, a lot of this work is about, raising a level of consciousness. So being able to move out of a fear-based consciousness to one of love. And it's a little bit odd, obviously, to have a chapter about sacred plant medicine in a leadership book. You don't see a lot about that. But the work that we do is really, working with high-achieving executives and entrepreneurs to overcome some of the most stubborn and persistent roadblocks. And it's the exact thing that, me and my partner have had to do. And plant medicine came into our lives and, really taught us how it can be used really effectively to move through change pretty rapidly. And I know in the last podcast was really about how these medicines can help with stress and anxiety and well-being. Not that I haven't had my fair share of some of those symptoms as well, but I find equally plant medicines can be useful in the creative element, in helping new ideas and innovation, as well as creating clarity of purpose, clarity of who I am, helping to see some of the shadows and limiting beliefs that are in our way so that we can show up in all of our potential. And so we've been working ourselves with plant medicine for, I guess, 5 years or so. And now begin to have, clients that come to us that want to have that experience as it relates to creating change in their leadership and their lives. And I'm happy to dive into more specifics, but let me just check in terms of if that answers.
No, that does. Please keep going. I'm. This is great. By all means.
Yeah. So, let's see. We've worked with a variety of plant medicines. I guess I would say that there's always the caveat of setting with plant medicines, and that it's really important that you are doing it with really great intention and reverence, and are doing it in a sacred kind of ceremonial way. So you hear about the bad experiences that happen when an individual tries to do this in their basement by themselves or out in the woods by themselves. And so just as like a first and foremost, I would never recommend that type of thing.
Yeah.
But if an individual really feels guided to this type of work, these medicines can have profound effects.
Yeah, it was funny. I was talking to one of my friends about a experience he had, a bad experience with psychedelics, and he'd done them multiple times, but he said the one time it's gone bad is like I did it because I was in a group and everybody was doing it, so I just did it, and it was like the worst thing in the world. But no, it's interesting. Like I've talked about this before, right? That you talk about like ceremony and doing it with reverence. I think we lose so much of that. Like we don't really have ceremony in our culture anymore, right? Like not in any long standing way, right? Like I think we try to invent new types of rituals and stuff that aren't really grounded or rooted in anything. But I think that's so important for people to realize, like that we have to, our culture, humans have been rooted in ceremony and story for so long that we kind of have to like keep some of that alive, right? And if your purpose is just work and making more money, right, you're kind of missing out on this broader experience that we call life, right? And missing the big picture. That's a little bit of a tangent from where you're going, but
no, it's absolutely true. I mean, I think the thing that I cherish probably most about some of the plant medicine work is the ritual and the ceremony, because I didn't have it in my life at all. I didn't have kind of indigenous roots and teachers in my life in a community that really embraced that. And so being able to learn from, Peruvian cultures, from Mexican cultures, from Native American cultures about what it looks like to be in ceremony and to be in kind of that ritual of trying to understand ourselves better in an effort to grow has been, God, so rewarding. I love it.
You know what else this kind of ties into that I was reading about is, and maybe you could talk about this a little bit, is you were referencing horses and how and how animals can kind of give us insights right into ourselves. And I don't know, have you ever seen the documentary called Buck?
Mm-mm.
You should check it out. It's about probably like the world's foremost horse trainer, and his name is Buck Brannaman. He's unbelievable, and he was really the one who kind of took, it used to be that people used to break horses, right? And it was a fairly like violent thing where it was, I'm man and I'm stronger than this animal. And he kind of figured out, I mean, they call him the horse whisperer, right? But he figured out a way to relate to the horses and make them feel comfortable. And his quote always is that the horse is like a mirror to your soul, and that he doesn't train people with horse problems. He trains horses with people problems. And there's this great scene at the end of the documentary, not to like give it all away, but there's this horse that's awful that he can't really even work with. And he looks at the owner and he says, I think this horse tells me a lot about your life. And I just thought that was so fascinating. But maybe you can kind of talk about how that ties into, I think it relates perfectly to what this chapter in your book around horses and how they kind of mirror, right, what we're feeling.
Yeah, and they are incredible teachers, and I love the reference to this documentary. I will check it out. Have you ever been around horses before?
Not much. I really want to. I have like this, I feel like I should have been born in like Montana or something sometimes and been a cowboy, but maybe that's just because I watch Yellowstone a lot now. But no, not much. I think I've been on a horse like once when I was very, very young and, you know, been around him a little bit, but never like done any serious trips or anything like that, like horseback riding.
Yeah. You know, horses are these, are kind of our greatest secret teachers. And it's not in the way in which we know or the way in which we think. It's not like you get on the back of a horse and all of a sudden you have these profound insights. It's
right.
When you're working on the ground with a horse, and that gentleman saying, you know, this horse tells me a lot about your life, is absolutely true. So horses are prey animals, whether folks know that or not. And that's one of the primary things in terms of how they become such great teachers, is that they're constantly assessing their environment for safety.
Yeah. One of the things, and not to interrupt you, that he says is that you have to think about when you're getting on a horse what you're asking it to do. He said, okay, first of all, you put a saddle on it that's made out of other dead animals. Then I'm going to get on your back in the same way that a lion would attack you. And he's like, believe it or not, they'll let you do it if they trust you.
Yeah, absolutely amazing. And so because of their way of operating in the world, they become really great mirrors and magnifiers of our inner states. And so being able to mirror back our emotions, whether we recognize those emotions or not. So if we're coming into a space with a horse with fear, even though we're putting on that mask that says we're excited, we're brave, we're courageous, we're going to be right next to a 2,000-pound animal, the horse is going to sense that without you saying a word and flee. They're going to run away or walk away, whatever the situation might be, because you are not safe. You are not congruent in your system. And so that's one tiny example of like, how do we gain some self-awareness by working with a horse? Like, it causes, if a horse is running from you, you need to take a good look at yourself in terms of what is your current state? What is your emotional state? And then they oftentimes magnify. So it's interesting to work with a client and say, you ask them to lead a horse through an obstacle course. And
so will you do this with your clients? Will you bring them to like a ranch or something where there are horses?
Yeah. So we have
so
horses
interesting.
Here on the property. Yeah. And we use a couple different facilities just based on the weather and those kind of things. But the horses will reveal all I need to know as a coach. Like I always say, you can lie to me and I may not know, but you can't lie to this horse. Like this horse is going to
smarter than both of us, right? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And so they have really profound teachings. And I would say this is probably a little bit out there, but horses also have this beautiful ability to bring you into such a place of presence that a journey similar to plant medicine is actually possible.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, I know that's hard to believe if you've not had much experience with horses, but I've had many experiences in those situations.
Well, and not to bring up another thing about horses, but Horses for Heroes, are you familiar with that? So, I'll just keep throwing these out there, but this Navy SEAL, I forget his name, who was suffering really badly from post-traumatic stress, kind of found solace in horses. And he started this foundation called Horses for Heroes. And basically they take vets who are dealing with depression and anxiety, and they basically give them a horse to like train and raise. And then they go on like I don't know how long it is, like a month or two, 1 or 2 month long trip, like through the backcountry of Montana in the winter. And like their job is to like take care of this horse and to,
oh my goodness. And
it's like, it becomes this whole teamwork thing, and they've got like unbelievable success rates with their clients, I guess you could call them, like reporting, you know, hey, my depression's gone 6 months, 8 months, 12 months out. So it's really interesting.
That is fantastic. Yeah. Something magical happens when you're in the presence of a horse.
Yeah.
And I don't think we have all the science to back it up, but it's certainly an experience to be had.
Can you talk about a little bit maybe what happens when, maybe outside of the horses, when people come to see you at the ranch?
What happens?
Yeah, like
Like,
what's are there team building activities going on? Maybe just kind of like dive into your process a little bit.
yeah. So we have a couple different avenues in that in the work that you can do with us, and so
Yeah.
we oftentimes start off one-on-one. So a leader, executive entrepreneur, finds us and is like, hey, I really need to be able to move through change in a different way. And so it's oftentimes a conversation of, well, how do we get through that? And our growth formula really is maybe a little different than most coaches in that we always incorporate a peak experience. And so that peak experience is really important from a place of, it allows you to shift paradigms quickly. And so plant medicine is a peak experience we use, as well as horse, so the equine experience. Breath can be a peak experience. There's a lot of different avenues, but it's central to our process. And so you might come and work 2 days with us with a horse or horses as it relates to your specific change, improvement, goal, or desire, intention. And so we move clients through a change process called the immunity to change, and then give them a peak experience to allow them to experience something different. And so working with a horse or working with plants will, without a doubt, shift the way that you see yourself and see the world. And then on the other side of that peak experience, then we have an opportunity to integrate change in a different way. Because you can't unsee these things of yourself when you have these kind of salient experiences. It just kind of shifts your orientation. And so then we create different experiences, different experiments to allow that individual to move through change and integrate it into their life and their leadership in different ways.
So interesting. Do you ever encourage your clients maybe to go out on their own, and instead of trying to strike change within their organization, maybe start something of their own and kind of carve their own path? Or is it more around evoking change within an organization?
It more often than not shows up and turns into them carving their own path.
Really?
If they're coming to me, they're oftentimes at a point of something needs to change. And so there's already unrest within them in terms of they've tried a bunch of things. Like they've probably tried every self-help book, they've tried training courses, they've tried all these things, and they haven't had any luck.
You're the last.
Right?
You're the last hope, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So then they're really serious. Like, okay, let's. I gotta change this. And so more often than not, we find that this individual is just perpendicular to what they actually want in their life. And so, as an example, I've worked with a CEO of a company out in California, and a CEO, right? And she came to me and she's like, I think I just don't have any passion for what I'm doing anymore. But what do you do when you're the CEO of the company? And had a really profound plant medicine experience and came back, and we worked her through a transition of getting her out of the company so that she could do the very thing that she was most passionate about.
Wow.
So it's really
Did she, you don't have to maybe say what exactly she went and did, but was it business related, or did she take like a totally different path?
a totally different path.
She did, huh?
Yeah.
That's so interesting.
Down the healing arts. Yeah.
Was she in a place where she needed to figure out how to fund a lifestyle, or was she more in a position where she could where she didn't have to worry about that? And if the former, how did you kind of navigate her through that?
Yeah. So it was both. It was her lifestyle wasn't so extravagant that it was like, if I choose a different path, I'm going to be, destitute kind of thing. And so there was some wiggle room within her path to be able to provide her some cushion on the other end to say, hey, I'm going to try something different. And she's also chair of the board of her company. So she's still a part of this company, but not running daily operations.
Right.
So there's still some creative ways to allow, transitions and some of those monetary momentary needs to still happen as you move through change, but neither of us would have had any idea that that's the path that would have emerged at the start of our engagement. It's just wild.
Yeah. What's interesting is I kind of have this idea, especially I've found as I've started to move up and had more financial success, that at some point you kind of have to decide the type of currency that you want to chase. And there's different types of currencies outside of the dollar. And so one of the things I've always thought about is, you only get so many minutes, seconds, days, right? Before we all eventually croak. And, one of the things I always think about is at some point, what's the trade-off between the money currency and all the other currencies that bring you happiness? Yeah. For me, I think, and for a lot of people, right, it's freedom and time, right? You want your time back. And I often wonder, and I'd be curious to get your thoughts, if at some point the whole organizational and corporate structure will kind of go away, and if we won't all just have be like Uber drivers, but for organizations. Maybe not everyone, but I'd love to get your thoughts on that. Like if you'll wake up in the morning and it's like you check your queue for what what would be rides, right? And it's like jobs that you can do. And I just wonder, I see more and more people going into freelance. And I know you're dealing with a lot of people who are in high paying positions that are maybe going out on their own. Have you noticed that a lot? And I see a lot of people who are opting to do I'm going to go work as a 1099 for this company for 6 months and then go do something else.
Yeah. I have no doubt that the landscape of our organizational structure is going to shift. I don't have a specific idea in terms of what it'll look like. It could very well be that type of model. The self-management revolution, if you've ever read about holacracy or kind of the Zappos model where we've kind of taken a roll back and say, we don't have bosses anymore, and we're going to let you self-manage the work that needs to get done, is a little bit along that path. So I could see the corporate or the organizational environment continue to shift in those ways where individuals have more autonomy over when they work, how they work, and who they work with. But I think there's still going to be...
There has to be some sort of structure, right?
Right, or you just get chaos. But, one thing that you said about you kind of debating this currency idea, is it money that I'm chasing, or is it time or freedom? The really fascinating thing and I'm completely with you, and time is my most desirable currency.
It's the one currency that we all have the same amount of each day, right? There's very little equality in life outside of that.
Yeah. But the higher up in the organization that you go, the harder it is to make that trade-off. And the harder it is to understand what it feels like to have the currency of time. So just for example, I'm working with an individual that is the highest that you can go, on the C-suite team, but has never experienced freedom in working life. Has always been in a corporate gig, a salary gig, working 80 hours a week, and so has never felt like what it feels like to work with more freedom and flexibility in your time. And so, she can't even really relate to this currency conversation because she's never even experienced it. And I hadn't before I had my corporate crack as well. But now that I've experienced what it feels like to have more abundance in the currency of time, there's no way I could go back. Yeah.
It's almost sad too. I've noticed, being March, we've had in Nashville at least a couple 75 degree days, where it's just beautiful outside. And I've had this Red Sea parting of the waters where there's an hour and a half or 2 hours where I don't have any calls and I'm kind of caught up on everything. And the other, last week, I just kind of I just went up to my room and changed into my workout clothes and went for a run. And I felt like I was cheating my company out of something, It was I've really lost sight of, what's important here sometimes. It's I felt so much guilt about not being chained to my computer for that, 30 minutes, 40 minutes that I was gone, right?
Yeah, and that's one of those, corporate culture things that I think need to shift and is shifting. This idea of butts and seats is the productivity measure of success. is such a fallacy. Like, you give people the autonomy, go for a run, do your meditation, do whatever you need to do. Just get the work done by the time that we need it done. I don't care when you do it.
Yep.
Provides incredible satisfaction.
And I think some of it too is what we were going to earlier with, like, you've got to make it okay with yourself too. Because I've even had times where I've had a boss say it's okay, but then I still feel like if I'm, but
Yeah, that's on you.
that's on me. That's on me. No, it's interesting too. And I think too, right, we were talking about social media earlier, right? You're always connected, right? So I've finally turned off like the push notifications on my phone after certain hours, because it was like, I'd be getting emails at 8:39, 10 o'clock. And even going back to the freedom thing, when I was talking about, I started out my career in New York, the hours were bad, but we used to call it the oil rig, because you'd get staffed on like a merger, and because we were doing like due diligence for the private equity funds. And so typically those projects lasted 3 weeks, maybe at the most. And so you wouldn't really know when they were going to roll around. And so what was almost worse, and this goes back to the freedom thing, is what was worse than the hours was not knowing like when you were going to work. So you might just be like sitting there all day, and then you'd be waiting for the email to come in, and it was like 4:30, and you're about to go home, and boom, you get the email, and then it's like your whole next 14 days, like you're in the office and you're not leaving. And like, people complain more about that, like the not knowing, like I can't set plans all the time, than the working.
That sounds terrible.
It was pretty rough. I didn't do it for super long. But, well, look, I think this has been an awesome conversation. I really appreciate you giving me 45, 50 minutes of your time here. I think I've learned a ton. How can people get in touch with you? How can organizations get in touch with you? What's the best way to contact you?
Yeah, so you're going to find me on the internet machine at theuntethered.co.
Okay.
So that's probably the best way. You can find the book on Amazon or...
Yeah. And one more time for people, what's the name of the book?
Yeah, it's called The Evolved Executive. The Future of Work is Love in Action.
Second edition.
The second edition, which is the doozy edition. It took me way longer to write the second edition than the first edition.
Yeah.
And then you can find me on LinkedIn and Instagram under Heather Wickman, PhD, those types of things. So not too hard to find out there.
Awesome. Well, thanks again for coming on. I really appreciate it.